Grateful for our friendship and for the years of walking at least parts of the road together, and I've been extremely thankful for that. I just want to also use this as an opportunity to give a book plug, which is that Troy has written his dissertation, which has now been published, and I can't wait to read this. So I commend it to you and hope that you'll look at it. It's called One Church in Christ, The Confessional Foundations of Ecclesiastical Unity in Karl Barth from 1921 to 38. I think the second thing I want to say is that I'm also extremely grateful for Fuller, and I'm extremely grateful for the years that I had to be the president there. As absolutely absurd as it all was, it was actually a really amazingly important time in my own life and in the life of the seminary. And I would just encourage your prayers for David Goatley, who is the new president and who is just off to a great start. And he just has so many gifts that I didn't have, and gifts and temperament things that just mesh with that special thing called being a president of a theological seminary. And we have come to great unity of mind and heart, and I just delight in the fact that he is president and I'm not. My gesture is always, brother, over to you. Couldn't be happier, and happier that he is the one that's carrying that mantle. So please do pray for him and just pray for Fuller in general. So we're going to turn tonight, and no great surprise, to Daniel chapter 4, the next of the chapters. Now, before we get to Daniel 4, let me make a couple of comments. One is that perhaps the first sin of the Bible is FOMO, the fear of missing out. And it was really in the garden that we see its birth, when the fear of missing out on being God was the crisis of the garden. God had said you can go anywhere in the garden. You can do anything you want in the garden. It's all for you. Just don't eat of this one tree, partly because it would potentially give you the knowledge of good and evil, like God's knowledge. And it was the fear of missing out on that, as tempted and predatory as that kind of promise or hope might be, that in fact, Adam and Eve walk into a world of the fear of missing out. And at the core of sin is a great deal of the fear of missing out. The fear of missing out on feelings, experiences, control, power, but also the fear of simply fear. Fear is a biological reality before it is anything else. It's a neurological reality before it is anything else. It is one of God's greatest and deepest and most important gifts to us. The wisdom of good fear preserves our life. It sustains us. It gives us capacity to take risks, to go as far as we can, and then hopefully not too far, to be people who of judgment and discernment about what is safe, not only for us, but for others, to be able to live in a world where, in fact, the value of appropriate boundaries and not crossing some boundaries and feeling free to cross other boundaries is all an act of elaborate biochemistry that ends up happening in nanoseconds within nanoseconds, 24 hours a day, every single day of our lives. We know we are dead when we have no fear. And in the whole arc of our life, we will have fear. And it's wise fear, it's good fear, it's the fear that actually enables and strengthens and shapes our lives, and we need to encourage that fear. More on that later. But the problem with fear is the way that it can become a tyranny of fear. And it's this tyranny of fear that is the thing that the Bible again and again and again warns us against. Do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. Almost all of those fears fall in the category of what I would call tyrannous fear. Fear that is actually overextended, overwrought, overdramatized, overattached, wrongly placed, melodramatically felt. And it is not a fear about something that in many cases is actually about a genuine reason, a genuine danger, but it's actually about triggers in our finitude that might cause us to feel as though somehow we're going to experience loss, which we do not want, because if we can have the fear of missing out on being God, it means that we actually will not be eternal. We will always be finite. So part of fear is about facing finitude, limitation, but part of fear is also about being able to measure our capacity. And part of what happens as we grow up is that we have continuously, from before we're actually born, and certainly after we are born, our neurological life is giving us all the triggers and instructions about a world in which there are such things as real dangers, to which we need to be acutely aware, and which rather astoundingly, in a nanosecond, with a slight sound, we can be awakened or moved or caused to step to the side or just avoid, all in this elaborate scheme of being able to balance our lives in a real world of actual dangers. But in the process of our socialization, in the process of our education, our family, our particular context, our gender, our race, the sociological reality that we all inhabit and live in, there comes about also this growth of layers upon layers of tyrannous fears that stoke us and press us in ways that cause us to become paralyzed or terrified, simply unable to operate freely in the world because fear is so at hand. Tonight, the text that we're going to look at in Daniel chapter 4 is the persistence of fear that we've seen from the opening pages of Daniel all the way through to this moment in chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar, who holds the least, quote, reasons to be fearful, ends up being a person whose life is about the story of fear. And in chapter 4, we come back to it again. You would think in chapter 1, there's already been this demonstration. He's been clearly the conquering power. He's gotten what he wants. He's taken the best and the brightest. He's given them opportunity to be formed. They've produced well. He's deployed them in good responsibility. And then he has this crisis of chapter 2, where everything is just this horrific dream. Again, a story of loss, a story of pain, a story of change, a story of something that's going to somehow mean that his life is more precarious than he would ever want to experience. And he's so terrified by it that he wants a genuine, authentic word. How do I understand this apparent danger? And what am I supposed to do about it as a consequence? He amazingly gets given this gift by some people that are outside, certainly outside Babylon, and outsiders to the gods of Babylon, and outsiders to his culture, who don't carry into Babylon those names, but have only gotten adopted names. And they step forward and they yield something that he knows no human being on the planet could actually provide, and they end up providing it. And he is thrilled that even though it is terrible news, it's the truth. And that's worth actually trusting. And there's a resonance and acceptance of that even though it is as precarious as the dream had suggested, he now knows that it's true that apparently it's that precarious. Chapter 3, again, getting control. It's all about fear. It's all about his own fear management. And it's about predatory, tyrannous fear. How do I use fear to command everyone everywhere under my voice, because I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have set up the golden statue that you are now meant to bow down before and worship it. If you don't, I will take your life. Again, using fear as the thing that actually drives that whole lesson. Now, you would think after all this, and then they're rescued from the fire, and all of this is just pure mystification for Nebuchadnezzar. And again, just as in chapter 2, he has this, in a way, close encounter with the God of Yahweh, the God Yahweh, who is able to actually do things that he can't do, that no one else can do. It is awesome. In some sort of verbalized way, he confesses that he's heard and seen this and has been moved by the fact that this is the kind of God. And then you would think, okay, now maybe this time he's understood it. Do you know people like this in your church? Or in your own body? Who you would think would really learn. But again, of course, we seem to not learn. And Nebuchadnezzar is definitely a not learner kind of person. So we come to chapter 4, and all the same things are all still in place. It now looks different until it looks like nothing. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that live throughout the earth, may you have abundant prosperity, the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me, I am pleased to recount. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his sovereignty from generation to generation. Now, what we really don't know and never really are satisfied in understanding in Daniel is how much this is a genuine confession of anything. It's certainly a proclamation that in a way allows him to, again, take control of the narrative. Like, Yahweh has done this great thing, and I'm now going to just announce, did you know that Yahweh, who is the great and mighty God, did all things for me and for my kingdom? Again, all part of controlling that sort of narrative. And then we hear this. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was lying at ease in my home and prospering in my palace, as one does. Prospering in one's palace. I saw a dream that frightened me. My fantasies in bed and the visions of my head terrified me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me in order that they might tell me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the diviners, remember them, we've been with them before. And I told them the dream, but they could not tell me its interpretation. At last Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belshazzar, after the name of my God, and who is endowed with the spirit of the holy gods, a bit to work out theologically here. And I told him the dream. O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that you are endowed with the spirit of the holy gods and that no mystery is too difficult for you. Hear the drama that I saw and tell me its interpretation. Upon my bed, this is what I saw. There was a tree at the center of the earth, and its height was great, and the tree grew great and strong. Its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, its fruit abundant, and it provided food for all. And the animals of the field found shade under it. The birds of the air nested in its branches, and from it all living beings were fed. I continued looking. In the visions of my head as I lay in bed, there was a holy watcher coming down from heaven. He cried aloud and said, "Cut down the tree and chop off its branches and strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit, and let the animals flee from beneath it and the birds from its branches, and leave its stump and roots in the ground with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let him be bathed with the dew of heaven, and let his lot be with the animals of the field in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a human, and let the mind of an animal be given to him, and let 7 times pass over him. The sentence is rendered by decree of the watchers, and the decision is by the order of the holy ones, in order that all who may live will know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdom of mortals. He gives it to whom he will, and he sets it over the lowest of human beings. This is the dream that I, Nebuchadnezzar, saw. Now you, Belshazzar, declare the interpretation, since all the wise men in my kingdom are unable to tell me the interpretation. You are able, however, for you are endowed with the spirit of the holy gods. Then Daniel, who was called Belshazzar, was severely distressed for a while. His thoughts, in fact, terrified him. He parallels the same words and descriptors that were given to Nebuchadnezzar. The king said, Belshazzar, do not let the dream or the interpretation terrify you, parenthesis, as it does me, as I quake in my boots, waiting for the interpretation. Belshazzar answered, my lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree that you saw, which grew great and strong so that its top reached to heaven and was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose foliage was beautiful and its fruit abundant, and which provided food for all, and under which animals of the field lived, and in whose branches the birds of the air had nests. It is you, O king. You have grown great and strong. Your greatness has increased and reaches to the heavens, and your sovereignty to the ends of the earth. And whereas the king saw a holy watcher coming down from heaven and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and its roots in the ground with a band of iron and bronze in the grass of the field, and let him be bathed with the dew of heaven, and let his lot be with the animals of the heaven until 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and it is a decree of the Most High that has come upon my lord the king. You shall be driven away from human society, and your dwelling shall be with wild animals. You shall be made to eat grass like oxen. You shall be bathed with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you until you have learned that the Most High has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals and gives it to whom he will. As it was commanded to leave the stump and the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be reestablished for you from the time that you learn that the heaven is sovereign. Therefore, O king, may my counsel be acceptable to you. Atone for your sins with righteousness and your iniquities with mercy to the oppressed. And all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king said, "Is not this the magnificent Babylon which I have built as a royal capital by my mighty power and for my glorious majesty?" And while the words were still in the king's tongue, a voice came from heaven, "O Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, the kingdom has departed from you. You shall be driven away from human society, and your dwelling shall be with the animals of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you until you have learned that the Most High has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals and gives it to whom he will." Immediately, the sentence was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven away from human society, ate grass like oxen, and his body was bathed with the dew of heaven, until his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails became like birds' claws. So maybe this time Nebuchadnezzar will learn. Here we go again. A God who is as interested in redeeming and healing Israel as he's interested in healing and redeeming Nebuchadnezzar. A God of relentless pursuit. A God who is absolutely the hound of heaven. The God who will not let go. The God who will not be mocked. The God who will not be mocked. It's really an amazing thing when you look at the kind of totalizing power of Nebuchadnezzar. Part of what's happening in this is that he's the center of all things, as the tree suggested. It's all providing, all knowing, all reaching, all seeing, all covering, everything and everyone, and he is at the center. This is the peak of narcissism. It's the peak of any universe in which fundamentally we really believe that that's where we are. Now, of course, we don't show this easily, and we may not be narcissists, but by studies that have been done, there's a fairly significant percentage of people who are pastors who are narcissists. Narcissism, yeah, great news. Narcissism is a condition. It's a psychological condition. It's a very serious psychological condition. It's not something really, in this sense, I'm wanting to underscore. I'm not really wanting to play with it, because it's actually a condition that a person needs to take with full seriousness, and to understand how much their life and their work and their family and their ministry may be oriented, sometimes unself-knowingly, around them in a way that ultimately makes the whole universe need to somehow spin around their particular center. In this context, it certainly is clear to us, I think, that Nebuchadnezzar is that kind of person, and his understanding of himself and the way that he's orchestrated his kingdom. Now, I didn't grow up in a family that was like that, but I had family that were like that. I had 2 uncles who were extraordinarily powerful in their families in defining and totalizing themselves for the whole family. You could just enter their house, even as a little boy, I remember, just experiencing this sense that really, whatever's going to happen here, I think he has to decide it. Everything's going to be about what he wants and how he's going to sort of set the house in order. And everybody was continuously checking back in whether he was okay with the next step or even with what was just simply being said in conversation. It was terrifying to me. He was a very physically threatening person. I never knew whether he was actually physically abusive to his family, my cousins, but all I knew is I never wanted to cross Uncle Bill. Like, no way. And one time I remember doing something that was a tiny thing. This is the kid fear. I just had seriously bumped the driver's side of the rearview mirror. And I thought, okay, I think my life is over. I think maybe if Uncle Bill were to know, I might be gone by morning. That somehow, that was how ferocious he felt to me as a little kid. And it was unmistakable. And it was absolutely true. And now that he's long gone and his children and I have come to know each other as adults, and we've reflected together on those years as little kids when Uncle Bill ruled, it was clear that he was ruling with a totalizing power. I had another uncle who did the same thing, but not in the same way. This uncle was, neither of these were direct relatives. They were married to my mom's sisters. The other uncle was a man who did it with money, with lots and lots and lots of money. And he was more subtle, but absolutely controlling. And the goal was that you were going to be high on that list of recipients of his estate. And I remember even as a little kid not even knowing what an estate was, hearing them sort of, I don't want to get on the wrong side of dad because, in the long term it might not really work out for me. And it was like, really? Seriously? At 10, we're thinking about these things? But that was the way money and his power was really established. It was a totalizing thing. One of the things that's very scary about the era that we're living in right now is that there are so many totalizing leaders around the world. Lots and lots of totalizing leaders. 62 countries around the world are going to elect new senior top-level leaders in the next year, including our own country. And one of the things that is common among many, many of these leaders is that they are making totalizing claims. I alone am the only one who can be what you, the world, you, the people, need, and I am going to come, and really, there is no choice. It really is just me, or it's total disaster. That's being said in our own country, it's being said in other countries by different leaders, and it's all part of this totalizing scheme. Now, imagine if we could just walk back in history a little bit in our own lifetime, that there was a period in the 80s and again in the 90s when suddenly the whole universe seemed to change because of what was happening and breaking up in the USSR and all the things that related to the Soviet Union. Just before coming here tonight, I was on a phone call, which included Philip Yancey, and he was describing his experience that he's written about in a book that I would highly commend, What Went Wrong, Russia and Ukraine. And the reason he has authority to talk about this is not because he's a Russian expert, but because in that moment when the Soviet Union was dissolving and nearly dissolved, and when they were scrambling for a new set of bearings, they invited all the way into the Politburo and into the most senior places of leadership about 20 Christian Americans to come and tell them who they were supposed to be. The totalizing reality of communism was being thrown off. The vision of what they were doing, and it's almost a surreal story. I mean, I said to Phil, when I was reading this book, I felt like, am I reading fiction or nonfiction? Because it felt like, how could this have ever happened? But all the way into the core, Phil and several of these other people are invited to just come and speak about the reality of a God who can give life to diverse people and provide oxygen for the mind and the heart and a new set of social fabric that isn't defined by communism or by any sort of fascist scheme. And in this book, he details in very specific ways exactly how this happened and what the encounters were. Now, this never really got covered in the press, and for whatever reason, partly because of Ukraine, he decided that now was the time, along with other people, to coagulate altogether what their memories were and to write it down for the first time. But what was happening? What was happening was that totalization was going away, and it felt that way around the world. Right? It had this feeling of, wow, there is something happening. We are in the exact opposite of that swing. where all of that movement that felt like it was toward freedom is now exactly moving toward fascism or some version of that without having to be a right-wing radio personality or a left-wing radio personality. I think we all see these kinds of words and declarations and totalizing with one primary person in the middle, and the expectation that that person and that person alone is really the one who can actually deliver us. The reality of what is happening here in Nebuchadnezzar's life is a reality that can also happen in the most ordinary way in churches. When we think of some of the great church scandals that have happened in recent years, there's all kinds of forms of them. It almost always involves some form of abuse of power. It almost always involves some kind of totalizing claim. It might be between the pastor and the person that they may be individually abusing, or it may be a pastor abusing a whole congregation, trying to make claims that cause all of his followers to actually fall in line and do the thing that those totalizing gospel claims are saying. Anyone who's going to be faithful needs to live this way. And the sidebar, of course, is that they're not living this way, and that even in the living of that way, they are actually often abusing the congregation and people around them. What is happening? A totalizing claim that somehow, in the midst of all the other things that are swirling, there is this capacity to make a claim beyond the claim. And that's the thing that holds people hostage. And it's the thing that causes people to then say, how do I ever get out of this? Because I don't know that there is anything outside the bounds of what the totalizing claim has set for the frame of reference that I could actually then live into. I had been part of a college ministry when I was in college for a summer in a church that shall remain unnamed. And this church had a really, really high action summer with maybe 20 or 25 interns that would come to this church and sort of take over the place and do all kinds of amazing programming. It was a really fun, highly adrenalized thing, but it was a vision that had a totalizing leadership. This is the way to do church. This is the way to live as a disciple. This is the way to grow your faith. This and this alone. And one of the leaders of that, there was another experience that they were claiming I should have. And they said, if you think you could ever be a pastor and not go on this trip, well, it's like deciding you're going to be a doctor, she said, like by never going to medical school. A totalizing claim. Years later, I'm in my office in Berkeley. I look on my schedule. There's this name I recognize from that summer, who I have not seen since that summer. And she comes in and she says, I know you're surprised that I'm here, but I'm here because you saw something that summer that I didn't see. And for the last 35 years, I've continued to live inside that structure with those people and those expectations and that framing. What did you see that I didn't see? And we just kind of walked through the rhythm of our weeks during that summer, the people, the things that were being said, like that statement about you can't even think of going on in ministry, like deciding to be a doctor without going to medical school. I said, you heard those things? She said, yeah, I did hear those things, but I think I thought that they were just well-intended to say this would be a really good thing. I go, well, you could understand it that way. I think it felt more threatening to my oxygen than that. It felt like, wow, this could move in really close. And I'm not sure that I could actually survive in this structure. Here was a woman who had given her heart to Christ, who was absolutely seeking to only be devoted. She was earnest. She was straightforward. She was as uncalculating as a person could be. She just wanted to do what God wanted to do, and the people that were around her were saying, well, then you must do it this way. Now, I think we would all like to think that none of us are doing this. I hope that's what we think we're doing, that we're not doing this. But I do just want to acknowledge that there are subtle ways that this can happen, right? It can happen within a small group. It can happen within a person that might be a mentee of yours. It could happen in your family. It can happen in just overexerting power in a way that you want to make sure remains under control, even in the transition, let's say, of your successor, or in the character of a given thing, where you want to make sure it is just exactly like this and not like anything other than this. Those are tempting places where this whole sense of fear of missing out on being God starts to rise subtly or not so subtly within us and makes us feel like, no, I just think I just need to exert a little more power. Power can be good. God's given us power to be stewards of power. There's a lot of important things to do with power, and as we all know, there's a lot of terribly destructive things that can happen with power. This story in Daniel is a story of someone who is doing great damage by an overreaching extent of power. It really needs to be my way. I remember early in our marriage, a very funny little example of this, where a friend of mine had given me a plate. I'm not really into plates, really, but this friend had given me a plate, and it somehow felt like it should be on the wall of one of the rooms in our first little house together. And so I said, I really want this plate to be here. And my wife, who's really wonderful, said, really not so much. No, I don't think it really, let's not have the plate. I go, oh no, but I really need to have the plate, because I mean, that's a wall. This is my first house as a husband. I want my friend's plate on the wall. It doesn't have to be in the living room. It doesn't have to be prominent. You don't have to look at it. We can find a room and a space where I just go in there and sometimes look at the plate. What was all that little rigmarole about? It was all really about power. It was all about the feeling that I simply basically wanted my way. I said, I just want my way. Like, let's say in 2 months it comes down. Like, that's it. Then that will have fulfilled my need. But for 2 months, can I have my way and just have the plate on the wall? I took great satisfaction that somehow I was establishing a home with the plate on the wall. Now, marriage has provided all kinds of opportunities to be aware of just how totalizing my influence can be. My size, my gender, my voice, my role, my use of language, all of these things can be really coercive. Am I aware of that? I've become aware of that. I've become more aware of it than I would have been otherwise. And I've had an amazing teacher in my wife who has helped me to see that. And then along come children who are just really experts at teaching me about overreaching power, which then raises questions about, well, what do I think actually parental power actually is? How does it foster life and not oppress life? How does it nurture life and not kind of control life? And on it all goes, right? And certainly as a pastor, I've had people teach me about the boundaries of my own vision for all things, for great visions, for all sorts of possibilities. And I alone see the vision and want all of you to benefit from the great vision that I have as your pastor. And you're so fortunate to have me for this vision. Now, actually, I don't think I actually operate that way. But the reality is, I probably operate more that way than I can actually see by myself. Nebuchadnezzar had so isolated himself that no one could dare tell him the truth. Again, the soothsayers and wisdom makers are like shrinking violets. Oh, no, we're not touching this one. We've tried before, and it really didn't go well for us. So let's bring in Belshazzar, Daniel. Let's hear the dream. He'll tell you the interpretation. And the consequences of this is the opposite of being human. It's to turn Nebuchadnezzar's life into the life of a beast. In biblical language and metaphor, I think this is the opposite of the fear of missing out. Let's remove the things that are the sign of being made in God's image. Let's turn you not as a beast turned into a human, but from a human into a beast, and eradicate all of the markers, as it were, of what it means to be really human. And now try living in that way. Because that is actually what you're actually doing in this overreaching, totalizing, consuming, demanding, dominating power. You are overreaching who you're meant to be. Just be a healthy human being. That, I think, should really be the core of any seminary curriculum or any church ministry. What do we invite you to be? We invite you to be fully human. We invite you to bring your whole self into this context. The God who holds all things invites us to bring everything. We are a community that's seeking to learn and live what it means to be in that embrace, where in strength and weakness, we find the capacity to be able to actually live a fully human life. When the boys were little, we had a dog, and I loved asking everyone at breakfast what they were going to do that day, and then I would take the sweet face of our dog, and I would say, "And what are you going to do today?" And the dog would always say, "I'm going to be a dog today." And that meant that he was going to fulfill his identity far more than any of the rest of us were going to do. Because he was not going to try to be more than a dog or less than a dog, but we were going to go out and do all kinds of things today where at moments we were going to try to be more than human or surrender ourselves to being less than human. And the goal is to live our identity where we are truly human. And in the context of that, we find the freedom that Nebuchadnezzar ultimately recovers. But still, even when he is restored, which happens later in the chapter, and when he's brought back and things are flourishing again, he still seems deluded. This process is what causes the Apostle Paul to say, "I beg you, my brothers and sisters," as an act of intelligent worship, "to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." That is a vision of a process of ongoing freedom from any kind of totalizing vision of ourselves or of someone else. We live in an era where the need for that kind of ongoing transformation of our minds, the renewing of our minds, the awakening to who we really are meant to be in Christ, to what it really actually means to be human, which is so much bigger than our sociology and so much bigger than our race or our gender and so much bigger than our politics or our denomination or our leadership authority or our salary or our bank account or our health or our beauty or any of those things. All of that is whatever it is, and it all has its sort of appropriate place, but it is certainly not the primary place, and it is certainly not meant to be the thing that actually clarifies what it will mean for you or for me to live a fully free and mature and healthy and thriving life that can somehow, in the midst of our pain and our suffering and our inadequacies, we still find the freedom to actually be human and to belong to Jesus Christ as the one who is most fully human and who calls us and beckons us to follow, in part to allow us to be able to live a fully human life and to let others around us be released into that same discovery. It's really challenging to be a pastor, really, really challenging. And the competing constituencies, the competing visions, the declarations, verbal and nonverbal, of how a pastor is meant to be. How do you exercise your power? How do you lay down your power? How do you give your power away? How do you nurture other people's influence and strength? How do you fan their gifts? How do you help them and us together as a community grow up into Christ? Those are all things that have to be worked out on a granular level in every congregation. But in the context of that, we have to be clear in our own being and clear in the community. This is our trajectory. We are after this goal of being conformed to Jesus Christ, who will enable us to live a fully human life in a way that will give you freedom as well. I don't need you to be the one who makes me whole. That was the declaration when I said to the congregation in Berkeley eventually, I'm just really not here for your approval. I need approval. I need the assurance of friends. Of course I do. But the defining reality is I need to live and ground myself in the taproot of an understanding of God, whose approval and affirmation of me is so great. There was a woman who just hated me in the Berkeley church. She was Dutch, and she was a fighter, and she was a declarer. And every once in a while, I'd come around a corner, and all of a sudden there she'd be, and she'd like read me the riot act. Tell me all the things that I was doing wrong. And I said, wait. Okay, I'm totally fine with your giving me a critique. I am not here to be subjugated to your harangue. If you want to tell me things that you think are places I need to grow, I am fine with that. I am not fine simply being dumped on. That to me was an example of trying to practice what I was discovering about the importance of actually saying yes and no at the same moment. Like, I'm not saying you can't critique me. Not at all. I'm just saying you can't harangue me in a way that comes more out of your pain, I didn't say this, than out of my need to change. So part of it is figuring out how are you going to negotiate that space. But it's also really hard when in fact the things that are being said to us, you know, come from the hurt and pain in the lives of people that are around us. This is the nature of how we live. So we give each other our pain all the time. Here, let me share with you so that I can give you my pain. And I sometimes do hear sermons that feel like, wow, you've decided that you're going to work out your own therapy session on your congregation. I would discourage that kind of behavior. Do your therapy and then preach. And there will be some bleeding, but it's healthier bleeding if you've done your own work. The question is, how do we take responsibility for our own stuff while we know that people's stuff is all in the mix? How do we welcome that, receive it, and so forth, but not, again, respond by totalizing declarations? You all need to, it must be that all of this is for you, etc. Like, those are all potentially acts of great passive aggressiveness as a pastoral leader, instead of actually being free in the way that Nebuchadnezzar is meant to be free, in the God who holds all things, all mysteries, all challenges, all wonders, all pains, all agonies. And I can sit in my own with God and with others, and I can invite others to do the same with me or with others. And in the context of that, we grow in recalibrating our lives. This is why the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom is so critically important. It's a way of saying, calibrate your fear in light of the reality of who God is. Calibrate your fear in light of the character of God and the nature of God and the faithfulness of God, the persistence of God, the knowledge of God, the creativity of God, the recreation of God. Those are all like astounding gifts, but it takes a lot of work for that to happen. And that work is actually the gift of being a pastor. This is probably one of the things I most missed as a seminary president. I was a sort of pastoral president. At least that was my hope. But to be in a congregation week in, week out, faces in every seasons of life and changes of circumstances and all the highs and lows and middles and eccentricities and the weirdnesses of church life and the hilarious offenses of church life and also the sorrow and the beauty and the wonder of church life and the extraordinary gift of being with people who have walked, in so many cases, much longer with Christ than I certainly had. And to let that all reinform me again about how to calibrate that I am not God, that I am not at the center of the universe. In fact, we used to do a liturgy at First Press that we had written and would modify in different ways over the years. It began with me saying, I'm not God. And the congregation thunderously proclaiming back to me, you're not God. And then I had the great joy of saying, you're not God. And them saying, we're not God. And then we would go through a list in this litany of other things that might be making totalizing claims on our lives, ultimate claims about what really matters most. And in the context of that, laying down all of those small I idols, or medium-sized idols, or bigger idols. How do we lay all of that down so that it's clarified to us that we are in the presence of the one who is God, who's called us together as a community to lay down all of these diversions, all of our fear of missing out, and actually just learning what we are given and receiving that as human beings in the weakness and the strength that we bring to it. So many things during my time at Fuller were formative to me. And among the things that were formative to me were the chances to step inside other people's stories in a different way than I feel like I'd been invited to do. There's something about being called president which gives you a different entry point in people's lives than being a pastor. And sometimes they fight one another, and when they did, I always would have rather been the pastor than the president. But being the president gives you a certain angle of people's stories that are told often against the institution, right? They come in to say, this is what, okay, let's just receive all this. They're not talking to their pastor. They're talking to the head of an institution that they think is disappointing them, wounding them, confusing them, whatever it might be. And in the context of that, you have all kinds of opportunities to see and hear more rawly and pointedly at me, at the board, at the faculty, at ... whatever it might be. And in the context of that, not least in a season when evangelical churches around the country and around the world, for that matter, is really in a significant meltdown, there was just a lot of opportunity to learn a lot about people's scenarios and the pain that they were carrying in a way that I had not heard in quite this way. And the challenge was really, am I able to receive this? Can I actually, like good improv, just receive what's taken? I'm just going to receive what you're giving me. I want to hear it. I want to understand it. I want to walk with it. I want to inquire about it. I want to figure out if there is some response that you're asking for, what that might be. Those are all part of ongoing conversations. But the most important threshold is really the one that Mary has been underscoring, which is really this sense of how do we come to actually just know one another. And they were giving me some of the clearest possible windows into spaces in their life that I would not have known had they not come and raged in my office. And sometimes those were not pleasant experiences, of course. But sometimes they may not have been pleasant, but they were transformative for me. And they were privileged because I felt like I was being given something that I actually considered was really a gift, as painful as it might have been at various times. This all kind of came to a crescendo moment when at a baccalaureate service, maybe some of you are aware of this story, at a baccalaureate service in the middle of the sort of the George Floyd days and everything that was going on about that, and our black students were particularly anxious and angry about things that Fuller had and hadn't done. And they knew that I was with that cause, but they also knew that I was the man, and therefore I was the one who somehow, in their view, held the primary responsibility for the institution not changing and responding in ways that they believed should happen. And we had been working at this very extensively, but there came a moment when we began to hear early in the week of baccalaureate that there was going to be something that was going to happen at baccalaureate, which was going to be some kind of demonstration. We didn't know what it was going to be or how it would unfold. And in the context of simply having that news and then having it confirmed in the real moment, like, we had our hearers and seers telling me, no, it's on, like it's going to happen. And again, I'm sitting on the front row, facing the stage, don't really know exactly how this is going to happen or what's going to be said or done or whatever it might be. And it turned out that there was about, I've forgotten, I haven't really counted, I'll say it was like 20-ish, maybe 25 black students who came, it was outside, and these 25 black students wearing surgical masks, pre-COVID, so this was not like the mask of the day, surgical masks, carrying signs that said things like toxic Fuller and other such phrases that were just really hard. And baccalaureate, as all of you know, is the service where often families come into town early for baccalaureate so they can be there for commencement. And especially at a place like Fuller, you have all these international families that have flown in, and you specifically have a really large number of Korean families who have come into town, and all of them are there with no knowledge of any of this, and some of them know English, and many of them do not know English. And this is all unfolding before them, and now lining the stage in every direction were these 25 black students with surgical masks and posters, standing in silence. In the context of that, you just pray that God would give you discernment about what's happening. How can you respond to this circumstance? I wanted to welcome it, as painful as it was, as awkward as it was. It was like, how can I say anything about this that's going to actually be meaningful to the congregation, especially that congregation? So the service went on for a couple of beats. A few things had happened, and then there was sort of a moment where it felt to me like I needed to jump up and say something. So I said, I just want to pause for a minute in the service and just acknowledge that something really important is happening. That this is a story of students we love, and they're giving every evidence that we are not doing a good job enacting that. And their pain has brought them to the point of now standing here on this occasion, which doesn't mean we're provoked to pity, nor does it mean that we're provoked to any particular action, except trying to be sure that we're paying attention to what's going on. So let me just allow us to sit for a moment with eyes wide open and to just look at the faces of these beloved students who, in anger and sadness, are protesting an institution that is not serving them in the way that they are needing. Let's just receive it. So we sat for a while, just in silence of that. I said, now, it may be that there's somebody that's come prepared to say something. And if so, I'd like to invite you to the stage. Whatever you'd like to say, 5 minutes, it's yours. So nobody came forward. Eventually, a guy who had a poem that he was prepared to recite stepped forward. That happened. Service went on. It was clear that there was more behind the demonstration. The preacher had been subscribed to the task of also speaking about the protest. Now we're coming toward the end of the service, and I said, this has been very sobering. And there aren't easy answers to the things that these students are protesting about. There are things that are being done, but no pretense, we're not there. And this is an evangelical seminary. I want to hearken us back to the Sawdust Trail and just say that I feel like it's an altar call. It's not an altar call for all of you. It's an altar call for the administration and the faculty of Fuller to hear this call. Our students are crying to us. Do you see us? Do you hear us? Do you understand the narratives that we're living that do not find their place here in the way that we need them to find their place here? Are we willing to hear that? And if we're willing to hear that and receive that message, and if we're prepared to receive the call that I'm now giving you, which is that we are hearing this and will respond with tangible action that will more graphically and tangibly demonstrate that we're on this track, then let's please stand as an act of your acceptance of that message and your commitment to respond as a faculty and as an administration. So everyone else remained seated. The faculty stood. I knew it was slightly coercive. This is where it was potentially overreaching. I wasn't trying to make everybody stand if they didn't want to stand. I did use language of, if in your conscience you are willing to do this, then I would invite you to do this. So we had this time of prayer, and then we committed ourselves at the end. I gave a charge and said, this is what we're going to be doing next. Now, in the classic scene of this moment, which I will never forget, so that's over, and now I'm moving to the side of the stage, and I go down a few steps, and now there's a long line already of Korean families who are lined up for photos with me. So we've just come through this, pregnant moment, this je ne sais quoi, that was that baccalaureate. And now there's lines of families that want me to stand and smile in the happiness of baccalaureate with their nearly graduated student. As I'm doing that over here, someone gets a microphone on the stage, and now a different kind of rhetoric comes up. The mic is live, they go excruciatingly live in condemning me and condemning the board and condemning the faculty in various ways. It was all just a really protracted, hard moment. I felt like I don't want to be the person over here on the side. I need to be like a real person in the presence, not to stop what was being said. So I tried to just come up from the side and just be present listening to what was going on. And then that came to a close. That was its own very, very dramatic thing. And then I went back down for more photos. A second photo opportunity. Now, I'm telling you that story because all of us face moments where in live theater, and it is, by the way, always live theater. In live theater, what are we actually going to do in a moment where there's a need for authority, but there's not a need for coercion? There's a need for control, but there cannot be fear over letting the reality of what's actually being said and felt to actually be received. I think I gave myself a B. It was okay, but I felt like in the context of that, we cannot as an institution or as a pastor or as people in conflicted congregations or in hot meetings, session meetings, congregational meetings, whatever kinds of meetings, it's live theater. How do we keep our bearing that we are not God, that they are not God, that the issue that we're debating is probably almost surely not first order. It's probably second, maybe third or fourth order, but somebody's got to be in their bonnet about the thing. And in that moment, in live theater, we're going to actually tell the story of the gospel in an entirely different way. So who do we think is God? To whom does this church belong? What is the meaning of our decisions in our community together? How do we understand those values? How do we sort all of that out so that we do not become Nebuchadnezzar, who decides to simply take control again and forget again? I was trying, in that case, not to take control, but to provide attendance, sort of shepherding, but not like, I don't know where this is going. I have no idea what was going to happen that day, or what was going to happen after I said whatever I said, or what was going to happen when I stepped down from the stage. I'm saying these things granularly because they are the places where the evidence of whether we're free is so needed. It's so, so needed. Now, that was a long time ago. To some degree, it was traumatizing to me. And it meant that the next year, baccalaureate, it's like, oh boy. Everybody understands in a way that commencement's a little inviolable because it's commencement, so let's not do that at commencement. I've just heard that Fuller's not going to do baccalaureate this year for various good reasons. I thought, oh man, are they being attentive about commencement? It's always live theater. Leadership is live theater. Life in exile is live theater. It's not staged. It's not liturgically framed. It's raw. It's uncertain. You're strangers in a strange land. Stuff is happening. You have to respond. Those are the moments where the reality of the gospel needs to be evident in our lives. And that means it has to be in our lives, and then it has to be practiced in our lives, and then it has to be developed in community, and then it has to be redeveloped in community. And then we get it wrong, and we do it badly, and then we come back and try to do it all again in some way that gives us a space for the God of grace who even restores a Nebuchadnezzar. So let's imagine tonight in closing that we've blown those live moments when we were meant to show up and do the thing, whatever the thing might have been. And it just didn't go well. It just turns out that even Nebuchadnezzar gets the blessing of God, the restoration and mercy of God, the recreation of God, that then, in his confusion even, still allows his leadership to unfold. The story of the book of Daniel gets much more complicated as it keeps moving. But I hope over these 4 little windows, through identity, through the question of whether we're trusting a God for things that are beyond any human capacity, whether we are able to distinguish the greater and lesser dangers, and whether we're able to actually live free from the narcissistic bent that often ministry even fosters and encourages, and instead find ourselves in freedom, being able to lead and hold power with freedom and open-handedness and humility and responsiveness, rather than any kind of suggestion that we are the ones who are holding the universe together. Thanks be to God. I am not God, and neither are you. Lord, thanks so much that we are not God. Oh my gosh, what a deliverance. Adam and Eve seem to have this fear of missing out on being God. And in our culture, there's all kinds of ways that we get stimulated in trying to be God. And as pastors, we sometimes wish we could be God. And all of that can just spin us out and do damage to us and to others and to the church and to the glory and the name of Jesus Christ. Lord, may we learn what it means to be human-sized, to be ordinary, to be grounded, to be who you've made us to be. And in the freedom of who we are actually meant to be, you say, now go. Be part of that 11 believer doubter gang that I send out to help change